Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Human Layer Podcast. My name is Mike Roven, and I started this podcast to talk a little bit about some of the observations I see on the day-to-day in my role as a service delivery manager for a technology company. I will continue to say that this podcast that I'm doing, the things that I talk about, not directly related to or connected to the organization that I work for, but some of this is just sort of stuff that I see and I think about, certainly in the world that we live in today, the climate that we're in right now, sort of in this country, in this world. So there's a lot of stress and strain financially on businesses, on organizations, on individuals. So we're putting a lot more focus and attention on how we spend our money, where we spend our money, and the service that we're getting from the money that we're spending. I know myself personally, right? When I'm getting my bills from my service providers, I'm thinking about things a lot more differently now. Like, am I actually truly getting the service experience, the service delivery experience that I expect from these companies? Not just the service that they provide, but how are they treating me as a human? We always think about that, but I think where we are in the world right now is we're thinking about it even more than we've ever thought about it before. And so I kind of wanted to have this little podcast, if you will, just to talk about some of those things and maybe help you in your day-to-day work if you are a service provider or work with service providers in sort of trying to help bridge that gap between the service work that you're doing and the humans on the other side of that work. And so one of the pieces I wanted to talk about, and one of the easiest ways for things to go sideways, is when we assume something is clear just because it's clear to us. I see this a lot where something makes perfect sense in our own head and we think that we've communicated it appropriately, but on the other side, it's actually being interpreted in a completely different way. So this may look like something where we communicate something, it makes sense to us, we move forward assuming that there's alignment, that there's understanding. We think it's been said clearly. What does that look like? Nobody asks questions. There's no sort of feedback as part of that conversation, or there's no pushback, right? No one pushes back and says, that doesn't make sense, or I don't know what you mean. So things kind of keep moving forward. And we've gone on and we've explained a scope of work or a service ticket that we're about to engage on, or how we're going to go about performing this work. And we don't hear back, or no one sort of pushes back. And we assume that means that whomever we're explaining it to understands it thoroughly. We've made that assumption now that I've said the thing, nobody's responded, so therefore that means that there's an understanding, that there's alignment. So things keep moving forward, but there maybe isn't alignment there. What's actually happening? Now, whomever sort of heard you or that was explained to is having some different interpretations. They're drawing their own conclusions. They're sort of taking what you said or what I said and, sort of drawing their own conclusions based on that. And what happens there, right? There's gaps in understanding. There's unspoken assumptions that are taking place. And so now, as we go to approach whatever it is that we're approaching, whatever work that is we're engaging upon, we're all slightly operating from different versions of the same thing. And I bet as I'm saying this and you're thinking about it, you're probably thinking about ways in your own personal life with maybe your partner or your children, where these kind of things can show up. Client expectations, project scope explanations, internal handoffs. This is a big one where service work is going across different teams and there's communication that needs to happen about what's been done, what's expected, what the client understands, and so on. There's a lot of communication and gaps that can happen there. And we see that often and how that manifests itself over time. Or quick conversations, ticket documentation, things of that nature, just the everyday stuff that we see on the day-to-day basis. Why does that happen? We're communicating things from our own context, from our own understanding of what the work is. We assume that others are then going to share that communication. We don't often, in the midst of a meeting or an interaction or an engagement, pause to check in and make sure that we're saying things in a way that makes sense to others, right? We say things in a way that makes sense to us most of the time, and that's perfectly fine, perfectly understandable. It's human nature, but we don't often stop for a moment and just make sure that we're saying this or explaining it in a way that makes sense to others, because the others aren't in our role. They're not doing the work that we're doing. So what are the ramifications, right? What can this create? Misalignment, frustration, someone saying, hey, I thought we were doing this. You may see those type of moments pop up from time to time. And unfortunately, what happens in this, and this is very common, and you're working in the service industry, you probably see often, especially on longer term engagements or projects or longer term service work, is things don't necessarily break right away. They begin to drift, right? It's those small pebbles that are building up to a big boulder over time. So to reframe a little bit of what the core messaging here is, clarity is not always what's understood, right? Alignment has to be checked, not assumed. And so it's important as part of the human interaction, the human layer, not just the service work, that we're checking in on the humans. That we sort of stop for a minute and pause, and we just act like people, just humans who are talking to each other, to make sure that the way that we understand it is the way that someone else understands it, especially when the outcome needs to be aligned and the same. So some examples of how we can do that, where we can stop in the midst of a conversation instead of just saying, does that make sense? Does that make sense? Because that's such an overused phrase nowadays. Can you play that back to me? Does that line up with how you're seeing it? Just want to make sure we're aligned before we move forward. Right then and there, by closing that gap, you have the opportunity to address any misunderstandings or misalignments. You may not get them all, but you certainly might close that gap by a lot, where you're less likely to get part the way down the road, and now you start to implement things and sort of turn things up, as it were. And now the person on the other side is going, hey, that's not what I thought we were going to do. That's not what I thought you were going to say. And you say, well, I said this. This is what I said we were going to do. Well, that's not how I understood it, right? A few things to sort of take away and remember. Assumption, right, is one of the quietest ways that things can go wrong. Silence in a conversation does not always mean understanding, and we do take it that way a lot. I mean, that's very common. I'm certainly not making accusations. I'm not saying anybody is wrong. I don't want that to be taken that way. I'm just sort of surfacing up some human layer things to keep in mind as you're going about your day-to-day work. We don't communicate in a vacuum. We communicate from our own context. So what's clear to me isn't always clear to you or to someone else. So something good to think about is that even though we're sort of framing this up in a way that we think this might make sense to someone, that's our interpretation of how we think it will be interpreted. So it's always good to stop down, take a beat, whether it's mid-meeting, mid-conversation, end of the meeting, end of the conversation, a follow-up piece of communication to say, here's what I explained. Are we in alignment of what the next steps are and what the outcomes are? So just stopping down, pausing, making sure that we're articulating ourselves in a way that others can understand can be a huge game changer in stopping that drift as we continue to go forward with our work, where we get down to the end of whatever that work happens to be. And then the client comes back and says, yeah, you fixed it. You did the work, but it certainly was not what we were expecting or what you communicated. And then you kind of get back into this sort of he said, she said type of situation. So just to recap and review, just because something makes sense to you doesn't mean it's been understood the same way on the other side. And most of the time, that's where things start to drift. So take that away. I hope you picked something up out of that. I'm going to tie it up there so I don't kind of go on and ramble for too much longer, but I hope that helps you. All right. Well, thanks again so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please do subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'd appreciate it. Give the videos a like if you like them. Provide some feedback in the comments if you have some topics that you'd like to see me discuss on the human layer side of things. So I think I can offer a lot of insight to you there. Again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.